Welcome, my sisters and brothers, to this, the homily for the 9th Sunday in Ordinary Time. If you remember, last week we saw Jesus, after having gone from synagogue to synagogue and homes, and then in the countryside where the man with leprosy, where he met the man with leprosy, now he comes beside the sea. So we're getting close to the time when the hints that the one who is more than Moses is going to enable an exodus across the sea that is greater than what Moses allowed. And we'll see how important that is for us this week. But last week we saw the choosing of Levi and the hint that the full Passover is now here, and therefore that priestly figures could become part of this new community because they were going to be able to live the fullness of the Passover now that the Son had come. And then answering the question about the fasting from John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees, Jesus indicated that the marriage banquet has come and that it's going to be more than your average marriage banquet. So even the garments and the wineskins need to be new. New forms and ways of being together are going to have to be invented to take account of this new community that is going to be living around the one who has already achieved what others were waiting for. And we continue with this today, remembering the proximity of the sea. One Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. Now, apparently the phrase he was going through the grain fields can mean that he was bypassing through the grain fields. And this is quite an important distinction because it means that he and his disciples were walking outside city bounds on the Sabbath so as to avoid the travel limitations that would be in place in different towns and cities. It would be clear how many yards or meters you could walk during the Sabbath. And by skirting round and going through the grain fields, this was a way of avoiding paying too much attention to what the travel limitations were. And there's even some suggestion that this Sabbath is what both of the same day is being referred to with both of our passages. But we'll see. So he's going through the grain fields, and as he made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. Now, this is already an interesting thing because this might be, there's just a hint that this might be a fulfillment of the beginning of Leviticus, where the first fruits were tremendously important, if I can find and the ability to pick them was something that was absolutely part. If you bring a grain offering of first fruits to the Lord, you shall bring as the grain offering of your first fruits coarse new grain from fresh ears parched with fire. So, here are the disciples, and they appear to be pre-celebrating the arrival of the Lord at a time that's not proper to do so. The suggestion is that by sign they're already indicating that the Lord is amongst them, and that therefore they're celebrating the offering of the first fruits. And the Pharisees say to them, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And here there's a rather interesting point because it's not clear immediately from what the Pharisees is saying whether it's the walking or the plucking that what's wrong. Probably both. But in other words, why are your disciples not paying too much attention to the Sabbath? And there's a particular interesting reason for that, which is that after the Passover and before they actually exited from Egypt, there was a period of 30 or so days during which no Sabbaths were celebrated. And the people could gather their food, bake bread that was supposed to last them for a bit, and take things from their house, from the houses of others and from themselves while they were being thrust out. And the language of thrusting is also the way in which people would refer to how you pipped bits of wheat out of the corn husks. So what are the disciples doing? They are enacting the movement towards the sea by someone by people who lived at a time when there were no Sabbaths. Sabbaths were suspended for that period of time and started up on the side in the wilderness when they received the commandments. Jesus gives a very interesting answer when he asks about this, when they ask him about this casual attitude to the Sabbath. He said to them, "Have you never read what David did when his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest, or perhaps in the face of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and he gave some to his companions." Now, this is a subtler story than it might seem, because David entered into the house of Nob. It was the priests of Nob. Of course, there weren't any priests at Jerusalem at the time yet. In the house of Nob, there were some priests who were considered bad priests. David was, at the time, in flight from one of Saul's outbursts of rage that sought to kill him. And so David was clandestine, finding some food for him and his men. And the priests of Nob, they were, they're properly shocked by David wanting to eat the bread of the present, but principally they were frightened as to what Saul would do in revenge to them if they took the priests, if they took the bread. Whereas, and incidentally, Saul was about to kill the whole lot of them anyhow, so that happened soon, and including killed Ahimelech, who was the father of Abiathar. Now, Abiathar, and the name means, the name is to do with fulfillment, fullness, excess, superfluity, suggesting already that Abiathar is going to be on the side of people being filled up. Abiathar wasn't actually yet high priest. He was about to become a high priest. So when Jesus says, when Abiathar was high priest, he means probably about the time that Abiathar was made a high priest, because Abiathar was the priest who favored David and later went on to take part in the founding of the site where later Solomon was to build the temple. So Jesus is saying effectively to the Pharisees by this story, are you being a bit like the priests of Nob who were worried that if somebody didn't obey rules, Saul would take vengeance on them? Or are you more like Abiathar, who was in favor of what David did? In other words, again, he's putting back the question to them as to what are they doing. He takes it out initially over the Sabbath question and asks them to put themselves in the position of people who have to judge which was the true priest, the priest who backed up what David was doing, or the priest who was terrified because of revenge. Then he says to them, in answer to their earlier question, so the Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. In other words, the Sabbath is for when it's appropriate for it to be Sabbath. Here my people are on their way out of Egypt. And it's saying, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And actually, it might be, because the Greek is the same, even Lord on the Sabbath. And if it's Lord on the Sabbath, then what we have, Jesus is calling to mind that actually these people on this Sabbath, which they don't have to celebrate, are honouring him as Lord by the pluckings of the first fruit. In other words, the definitive Sabbath is coming in. We had the definitive Passover, the definitive marriage feast, and now the definitive Sabbath. So, again, he entered the synagogue. So, this might have been the same evening. It's not clear. Again, he entered the synagogue, so it would have been a Sabbath. And it may have been that he was going to the synagogue through these fields on his way. And it was said, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. In other words, by this stage, the word has gone out. People are aware that Jesus is a wonder worker, and they really want to see that something can be done. Please notice the withered man with the withered hand is just there. He doesn't ask to be cured. He doesn't come forward. No one pushes him forward. Actually, it's Jesus who calls him forward. So they watched to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. So he says to the man who has the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he says to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" Now, and it says, but they were silent. So what has he done? Well, he's put before them the choice which Moses had put before them in Deuteronomy. Moses, in other words, about whom the whole of synagogue worship was based, had put in Deuteronomy, which is structured as just a long sermon to the people of Israel, he'd put in the middle and at the end these moments of choice. Do you choose to do this? Do you choose to do that? Do you choose life? Do you choose death? So Jesus is actually enacting Moses to them by saying, what did Moses say one should do? It's about doing good or good evil. What do you choose? And please, this is very important because this takes us back to the incident with the leper. Do you remember that the man who had leprosy came up to Jesus and said, "If you choose, you can cure me." And it said Jesus was angry and rebuked him. Why was Jesus angry? Because he was saying to Jesus, "If you choose," suggesting that Jesus, in other words, the Lord, could possibly choose other than life. So Jesus replied to him, "I choose," and then sent him on his way, but sent him to go and bear witness to the priests about his healing, because Jesus wanted the priests to know that the one who was coming in was one was the one who chose life, and that they should be prepared for the signs of what that meant. Remember that the leper didn't do that. He just went away. So here Jesus is coming forward and bringing the time to choose motif back. Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill? But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart. With anger because they were unable to do make the choice, which was after all what Moses was all about. And remember, his anger, just as he was angry before about the issue of choice, so he's angered here. He grieves at their hardness of heart. And of course, the moment we hear that, remember the definitive hard person of heart, and that was Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the person in Exodus whose heart was constantly being made hard. He chose things and then he unchose them. He changed his mind. His heart was hardened, and he changed his mind against Israel again. So the suggestion is that he's looking at them with anger because they are behaving more like Pharaoh than like Moses. Though he then says to the man, "Stretch out your hand." Now, this is a big one, because the Lord told Moses to stretch out your hand, and that was the moment that the Red Sea was parted. In other words, here Jesus is commanding the man with the withered hand to stretch out his hand, therefore becoming a sign that this is the way that Israel goes through. It takes the flight out of Egypt, away from Pharaoh and the people who doubt what God really likes and loves, which is life. And he said he stretched out his hand, he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And of course this immediately brings to mind the verse in Deuteronomy where God says, "I brought you out of Egypt with outstretched arm and with outstretched hand and mighty arm." In other words, here, enacted in the middle of them, boom, is the outstretched arm and the mighty hand. So Jesus has been more than Moses. He's given the instruction that the Lord gave Moses, and behold, it has happened. So you see that we're coming to the definitive moment of the Exodus being reenacted in their midst, with them playing the role of a rather temperamental Pharaoh. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. They understood exactly what this meant. This was really putting them on the spot, basically saying to them, "Are you going to be Egyptians?" something new is happening here. Finally, I'm putting the choice before you. What are you going to do? Are you going to be Pharaoh? Are you going to be the people of Israel? Are you going to be the Israel who's coming out? And guess what? Because the Hebrew scriptures are wonderful, there's another background story in the back of this they would all have picked up as well, because there was famously a king in the book of Kings, one of Solomon's descendants called Jeroboam, who at a certain stage had his arm withered by, he entered into a conflict with a holy man of God, and his arm was withered, and he begged the Son of Man, the man of God, to unwither his arm, and the man unwithered his arm. So there's a story precisely about a holy man of God, unnamed, who appears and is able to unwither the hand of a bad king of old Israel, thereby making it possible for him to carry on being king. So, again, the image is, here is the one who is making it possible for us to leave behind the old Israel with its withered armed kings, fulfilling what the man of God did in the book of Kings. Here is one who is making it possible for us to become the new Israel going forward in the shape that is to take now that the definitive bridegroom, Sabbath, and Passover is here. So the reenactment of Exodus, the very dramatic reenactment of Exodus, which must have been genuinely shocking, because if Jesus had touched the man's arm and cured it, that would have been one thing. But for Jesus to say, stretch out your hand, that was what the Lord said to Moses. And Moses did it, and it happened. So here is one who is more than Moses. No wonder the Pharisees and the Herodians conspired to destroy him. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen.